WION USA Direct live from September 20th to 30th.
President of the United States of America. This democracy
forward, looking at
the road to inclusivity, the road to reform that President Joe Biden and several presidents before him have promised.
celebration of India-US relationship.
A gripping week of diplomacy, drama, and some fun moments. How are we going to
The world is finally coming together against China. It's all happening right here in Washington, D.C., the first ever in-person Quad Summit and the Modi-Biden bilateral. All of this week, Gravitas will be coming live to you, first from Washington, D.C. and then from New York. This week will be a game changer for the Indo-Pacific and the world beyond. Join me, Palki Sharma Upadhyay, to watch the Gravitas USA.
And direct from WION Studios in Washington, D.C.
Hello and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. It's 9 p.m. IST, 11:30 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. It's day 2 of Prime Minister Modi's engagements in the U.S. And just a few minutes back, he arrived in the building right behind me. That's the White House. Today is a big day. It's also a day of firsts. The first bilateral meeting between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Joe Biden, followed by the first ever Prime Minister Modi just a short while back. The bilateral meeting is now underway. We expect the leaders to address the press before the Quad Summit. Now, this meeting is important for India, but more important for the US, I would say. Washington needs India's help to tackle a variety of challenges. There's Afghanistan, there's China, there's climate change, Wuhan virus vaccines, of course. There's a lot on the plate. And this is not an easy time for the United States. Many of its allies are unhappy with the Biden administration. So the US needs a country like India on its side to burnish its multilateral credentials. Long story short, it's a major partnership for the US, and Team Biden is putting its best foot forward for India. Yesterday, US Vice President Kamala Harris met with Prime Minister Modi to lay the foundation for today's bilateral. What did they discuss? Well, Pakistan, among other things. We are told that it was Harris who broached the P word. She raised the role of Pakistan in terrorism. She agreed that there was, quote-unquote, a need to rein in and closely monitor Pakistan's support to anti-India terrorist groups. We'll see more of this at the Quad Summit later in the day. Terrorism, of course, is a major issue for all members. And that meeting, too, will take place at the White House, the Quad meeting. And here's what you should know about the Quad. For the longest time, the quadrilateral engagement was informal in nature. There were no joint statements. There was no direct participation of heads of state. It was a largely closed-door consultation with little being made public. Then in March this year, 2021, this partnership was formalized. The leaders of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States had a virtual summit. So they're talking about a structure now. They're talking about the shape and scope of the Quad. Today's meeting should be able to concretize some of this. There are 5 key issues on the agenda. Number 1 is a free and open Indo-Pacific, which basically means countering China's military aggression in the Indo-Pacific region. Number 2 is connectivity and infrastructure projects. The Quad will look for ways to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. Again, a very, very important agenda point. Number 3 is the pandemic. The Quad has already announced a supply of more than 1 billion vaccine doses. So acceptance of vaccines, certificates, travel restrictions, all of this is expected to be discussed today. Number 4 is critical technologies, things like 5G and computer chips. And number 5, of course, is climate change. So the agenda is comprehensive, but it does not clearly spell out the name of the common adversary, which is China, and that remains the biggest challenge for the quadrilateral. How it navigates the China question will decide its relevance and future. So whether the Quad members agree or not, some of these goals cannot be achieved unless they clearly pick sides and shed hesitancy. They will have to break away from a certain brand of diplomacy if needed. India is already doing that. From non-alignment, India has switched to strategic partnerships. For years, Australia too has been wary of taking sides. It would not pick between the West and China, for example. But now Australia is changing its strategic posture with more defense investment and clearer alliances. In a few hours from now, the leaders of all of these countries, Australia, India, and of course their counterparts from Japan and the US, will formalize this shift. The question is, will they go the whole hog and make China pay? That's what we'll discuss today. Washington studios, James Schwemlein. He's a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. James has served at the World Bank and the US State Department in various capacities. Also with me is Jeff M. Smith. He's a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Asia Studies Center. He has testified as an expert witness for multiple congressional committees. And we have Joshua Phillip. He's an editor and senior investigator reporter at Epoch Times. Gentlemen, welcome to WION.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you.
The Quad meeting is going to happen today, and maybe we can start with you. What do you think is going to come out? What will be different this time? Do the leaders now have the political will to define the shape and the scope and the purpose of the quadrilateral?
Yeah, so I think it's a significant deal that the meeting is happening in person. It's in the COVID world in which we live. That's a rare thing. It's the first multilateral summit hosted at the White House, this administration in person, which is a big deal that we're making progress. But on the Quad in particular, I think most of the forward progress in the Quad has to do with China, and not necessarily concerns about China, but because of China's actions in driving the Quad to this point. So I think there's space for forward progress, but we have a long way to go in articulating an agenda.
Can you make progress when you do not even spell out who your adversary is?
Well, the Quad Alliance didn't fully spell out who their adversary was, but I think it's pretty clear that it's China. The whole context of it was about China, and it does seem to be moving in that direction. I think the biggest issue, though, everyone's talking about military development and making this military defense coalition maybe eventually. But really, I think the biggest thing is economy and challenging China on the economics front. And India does seem to be poised to do that with some of the meetings happening here.
The Indian Prime Minister is meeting the US President in the building right behind us. India's case is typical in the sense that India is the only Quad country that shares a border with China. So the stakes are that much higher for India. What do you think India should look at when it goes into this strategic partnership?
I think it should look for more commitments by the other Quad members to support India's interests. I think you rightly point out India is the only member that has a border with China. It's also the only member that's been invaded by China, the only member sandwiched between two nuclear powers with which India has fought many conflicts, with which are allied to each other and hostile to India. India in many ways is in the most vulnerable position of all the Quad members vis-a-vis China. And so I think it would be natural for India to seek more commitments from the other members, even in some cases that may be speaking up more forcefully when China launches provocative actions at the border, for instance. Those are the type of commitments I think India would like to see.
Also, the Quad is very clear in stating that they stand for something and not against someone. They're talking about climate change, they're talking about technology, they're talking about investment, which may be indirectly aimed at China, but not necessarily only China. It's a rather vague agenda. Also, all Quad members are heavily dependent on China-centered supply chains and Chinese trade. How do you think they will balance these two things as they look at containing the Chinese threat?
Well, I think part of the reason we've seen a new focus on soft power and a positive agenda is because there's an appetite in the region for the Quad to deliver a positive agenda. There's some concern among ASEAN and other countries in the region that the Quad was too security focused, was too focused on containing China, even if that was not the explicit objective of the Quad. So I think this new agenda we're seeing is in part a response to that craving for a positive agenda and for soft power, tangible victories on things like COVID vaccine deliveries, infrastructure development, 5G. I think these make the Quad more amenable to a number of neutral parties in the region.
What does the entry of the AUKUS do to the relevance of the Quad?
Well, I think in one part, the AUKUS answers the security question about the Quad. The Quad isn't the security architecture for Asia. We have a security architecture for Asia, and for the next 20 years in the United States. It's been a hub and spoke model. What we've had for years is Australia, Japan, and South Korea. Now with the UK added to that security architecture, we have a strong basis for collective security among those countries. The purpose of the Quad is to build the economic interdependence of the Indo-Pacific. The four corners of that region are these four countries economically, and that's the space in which trade policy, norms, standards have to align if we're going to collectively compete with China over the long term. I think the lack of a positive economic agenda is a major failing both of the United States and of India. Japan and Australia are both part of the CPTPP. Both were party to are party to the RECA. RCEP.
Yes.
The RCEP, which is the China-led agreement that ASEAN has formed, or the China-dominated agreement that ASEAN has formed. This is an architecture for economic interdependence that could be constructed, but has a long way to go.
How do you think countries in the region see these alliances? So there is an AUKUS, which only has 2 Pacific members, and then you have Britain. And then you have a Quad. And all of these South Asian countries, some of which have expressed concerns about the militarization of the region and how they should not be forced to pick sides. How do you think they see these developments in the White House?
I think the way they're seeing these developments is basically that the Chinese Communist Party has already been threatening a lot of these countries. And that's the reality of it. People talk about this as being a hostile thing, that they're challenging China, frankly, because that's the narrative the Chinese Communist Party is pushing. The Chinese Communist Party has not been hiding its agenda. It's, making territorial claims against the Philippines, against Vietnam, against Japan. It's threatening war on different countries. It's attacking border regions. It's doing all these things. And then you get a few countries getting together and saying, we need to defend against this if they do something more hostile because they're threatening it. And then suddenly they're the bad guys. That's the Chinese Communist Party's narrative. And I do think these countries see this happening, and I think they're hopeful that countries are going to stand up against the subversion and threats of the Chinese Communist Party.
Do you agree, Jeff? Do you think that countries in the region see these alliances as a positive development, or do they see more trouble in already troubled waters?
I think quietly many of them welcome these alliances. Many of them do hope that the United States, India, the Quad can stand as a counterweight to growing Chinese influence. They absolutely do not want to see a region dominated by Chinese hegemony. I think where we run into issues is that they are very reluctant publicly to take a stand that's seen as confrontational toward China.
और दरअसल मैंने तो 2006 में ये बात कही जब मैं राष्ट्रपति था मैंने उसी समय कहा था कि 2020 तक भारत और अमेरिका जो हैं वो सबसे ज़्यादा करीबी देश होंगे.
Maybe I shouldn't, these are not part of my prepared remarks, but when I was in Mumbai as vice president, I finished meeting with the equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce.
ये मैंने अपनी शुरुआती टिप्पणी में लिखा तो नहीं था, लेकिन फिर भी बताना चाहता हूँ कि जब मैं मुंबई में था वाइस प्रेसिडेंट के तौर पर, तो मैं उस समय चेंबर के अध्यक्ष से मिला था.
And afterwards, the Indian press asked me, do I have any relatives in India?
और दरअसल मैंने तो 2006 में ये बात कही जब मैं राष्ट्रपति था मैंने उसी समय कहा था कि 2020 तक भारत और अमेरिका जो हैं वो सबसे ज़्यादा करीबी देश होंगे.
Maybe I shouldn't, these are not part of my prepared remarks, but when I was in Mumbai as vice president, I finished meeting with the equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce.
ये मैंने अपनी शुरुआती टिप्पणी में लिखा तो नहीं था, लेकिन फिर भी बताना चाहता हूँ कि जब मैं मुंबई में था वाइस प्रेसिडेंट के तौर पर, तो मैं उस समय चेंबर के अध्यक्ष से मिला था.
And afterwards, the Indian press asked me, do I have any relatives in India?
और उसके बाद भारत की प्रेस के लोगों ने मुझसे पूछा कि क्या मेरे कोई अपने मेरे कोई रिश्तेदार भारत में हैं.
I said, I'm not sure, but when I was elected as a 29-year-old kid in 1972, before I was sworn in, I got a letter from a person named Biden, last name, in Mumbai, from Mumbai.
तो मैंने कहा थे मुझे मालूम नहीं, लेकिन जब मैं 29 साल का था और 1972 की बात है, उस समय जब मेरी समय पर मेरी जो कदम मुझे उठानी थी, उस समय मुझे किसी व्यक्ति ने खत भेजा था, उसका उन्होंने कहा कि मेरा नाम भी आखिरी नाम बाइडेन है, वो भारत से थे।
And I said, but I never was able to follow up.
उनको मैं फिर बाद में ढूंढ नहीं पाया।
Next morning I had a press conference going away, and the Indian press said, someone spoke to us, you have 5 Bidens in India.
और अगले दिन जब प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस हुई तो इंडियन प्रेस ने मुझे बताया कि आपके यहाँ पर 5 लोग हैं जो उनका आखिरी नाम बाइडेन है।
And although we never admitted it jokingly, that I found out that there was a Captain George Biden who was a captain of the East Indian Tea Company.
और मजाक में मैंने कहा कि हाँ एक जॉर्ज बाइडेन थे जो कि इंडियन टी कंपनी में कैप्टन थे।
That's hard for an Irishman to admit.
ये थोड़ा मुश्किल होता है किसी भी आयरिश व्यक्ति के लिए मानना।
It shouldn't be so casual. I hope you understand the humor. And the end result was that he apparently stayed and married an Indian woman. And I've never been able to track it down. So the whole purpose of this meeting is for to help me figure out.
तो मैं थोड़ा अनौपचारिक में कह रहा हूँ कि उन्होंने कहा कि मैंने भारतीय मूल की महिला से शादी की थी और उसको वो नहीं पाया था, तो मुझे आशा है कि एक दिन हम उसका पता लगाएंगे।
But all kidding aside, I think that the relationship between India and the United States, the largest democracies in the world, is destined to be stronger, closer, and tighter, and I think it can benefit the whole world.
लेकिन दूसरी भी मैं यही कहूँगा कि भारत और अमेरिका के बीच में जो संबंध हैं, हम दोनों सबसे बड़े लोकतंत्र हैं पूरे विश्व में, इन्हें और ज़्यादा मजबूत होना है और ज़्यादा करीब होना है और एक दूसरे के साथ रहना है।
And I think that's begun to come to pass. And today, we're launching a new chapter in the history of U.S.-Indian ties and taking on some of the toughest challenges we face together, starting with a shared commitment to ending the COVID pandemic.
तो ऐसा हुआ है और आज हम एक नया अध्याय शुरू कर रहे हैं भारत और अमेरिका के बीच में, और उसका पहला काम है कि हम इस बड़ी महामारी कोविड-19 को समाप्त करने के लिए वचनबद्धता व्यक्त कर रहे हैं।
The Prime Minister and I were going to be talking today about what more we can do to fight COVID-19, take on the climate challenges that the world face, and ensure stability in Indo-Pacific, including with our own Quad partners.
तो आज प्रधानमंत्री और मैं इस बारे में बात करेंगे किस तरह से कोविड महामारी को दूर किया जाए, किस तरह से जलवायु संकट जो बना हुआ है उसको हम निपट सकें और इंडो पैसिफिक में किस तरह से हम अपने आप को सुरक्षित बना सकें।
Of course, our partnership is more than just what we do. It's about who we are. It's rooted in our shared responsibility to uphold democratic values, our joint commitment to diversity, and it's about family ties, including 4 million Indian Americans who make the United States stronger every single day.
हमारी जो आपस में पार्टनरशिप है, जो हमारी सहभागिता है, इससे कहीं ज़्यादा है। हम जानते हैं कि हम लोग कौन हैं और हम चाहते हैं कि इसमें एक विविधता हो, एक हमारे आपस में पारिवारिक संबंध है, क्योंकि 4 मिलियन भारतीय मूल के लोग हैं जो यहाँ पर हमें हमारे देश को ज़्यादा सुदृढ़ और ज़्यादा मजबूत बनाते हैं।
As the world celebrates Mahatma Gandhi's birthday next week, we're all reminded that his message of non-violence, respect, tolerance matters today maybe more than it ever has. And so I'm looking forward to my discussions with the Prime Minister. Thank you.
और अगले सप्ताह जब हम महात्मा गांधी जी का जन्मतिथि मनाएंगे, उस समय पर हमें याद रखना है कि उनके जो बताए हुए मूल्य थे, अहिंसा, लोगों के साथ सहिष्णुता और आदर, ये आज के विश्व में पहले से कहीं ज़्यादा इसकी जरूरत है। और प्रधानमंत्री जी हम आपके साथ बात करने के लिए आगे आते हैं। धन्यवाद। आपका है
राष्ट्रपति जी, सबसे पहले तो मैं मैत्रीपूर्ण और गर्मजोशी भरा हम सबका भारत के डेलीगेशन का स्वागत करने के लिए मैं आपका हृदय से बहुत बहुत आभार व्यक्त करता हूँ।
First of all, Mr. President, I would like to express my gratitude for this very warm welcome full of friendship, not only to me but to my delegation.
2016 में और 2014 में भी मुझे आपसे विस्तार से बात करने का मौका मिला और उस समय आपने भारत अमेरिका के संबंधों में आपका जो विजन है जिसको आपने शब्दबद्ध किया था वो वाकई बहुत ही प्रेरक था और आज आप राष्ट्रपति के रूप में उस विजन को आगे बढ़ाने के लिए जो पुरुषार्थ कर रहे हैं, प्रयास कर रहे हैं, इनिशिएटिव ले रहे हैं, इसका मैं स्वागत करता हूं।
Mr. President, in 2016 and even before that, in 2014, we had an opportunity to have discussions in detail. And at that time, Mr. President, you had laid out your vision for the relations between India and the United States. And you had enunciated that in great detail, and really that was a vision that was inspirational. And today, Mr. President, as President, you are making all efforts and taking initiatives to implement that vision, and I warmly welcome that.
आपने भारत में बाइडेन सरनेम के लोगों के सामने अपना डिटेल में जिक्र किया। आपने मेरे साथ भी इसका उल्लेख किया था। बाद में मैंने काफी कुछ कागजात खोजने की कोशिश की है, कागजात में लेकर के भी आया हूं। हो सकता है शायद इसमें तो कुछ आगे का निकल आए, शायद आपको कुछ काम आए।
Mr. President, you have spoken in detail about the burden, the Biden surname in India, and in fact you had mentioned that to me earlier too. Well, after you mentioned it to me, I hunted for documents, and today I have brought along some documents. Maybe we'll be able to take this matter forward, and maybe those documents would be of use to you.
Are we related?
Yes. एक्सेलेंसी, आज की हमारी ये बायोलेटरल समिट, लेकिन मैं देख रहा हूं कि ये दशक 21वीं शताब्दी के तीसरे दशक का ये पहला वर्ष, मैं पूरे दशक की तरफ देख रहा हूं कि आपके नेतृत्व में जो बीज हम बोएंगे, इस पूरा दशक हमारी दृष्टि से बहुत ही भारत और अमेरिका के संबंध में, विश्व के लोकतांत्रिक देशों के लिए एक बहुत ही ट्रांसफॉर्मेटिव ये कालखंड रहेगा, ऐसा मेरा विश्वास है।
Mr. President, I firmly believe that in our summit talks and summit meeting today, what I see is that this is the third decade of the 21st century. This is the first year of the third decade. And I see that when I look at the entire decade, I find that under your leadership, the seeds have been sown for the Indo-US relations to expand, and for all democratic countries in the world, this is going to be a transformative period. I can see that very clearly.
जब भारत और अमेरिका के संबंधों में मैं ट्रांसफॉर्मेटिव देख रहा हूं, तब मैं देख रहा हूं कि ट्रेडिशन, लोकतांत्रिक परंपराओं और मूल्यों को लेकर के जो हम जी रहे हैं और जिसके प्रति हम समर्पित हैं, हम कमिटेड हैं, वो ट्रेडिशन का अपना एक महात्म्य और अधिक बढ़ेगा।
And this is when I see that this transformative period is in Indo-US relations. And when I talk about traditions, I'm talking about democratic traditions, democratic values, traditions to which both our countries are committed. And I find that importance of these traditions will only increase further.
उसी प्रकार से आपने उल्लेख किया 4 मिलियन से अधिक लोग भारत के यहाँ अमेरिका की विकास यात्रा में सहभागी हैं। ये दशक में टैलेंट का अपना एक महत्व है। पीपल टू पीपल ये टैलेंट इस दशक में बहुत ही प्रभावी भूमिका अदा करेगा और भारत की टैलेंट अमेरिका की विकास यात्रा में पूरी तरह सहभागी होती चली जाए, उसमें आपका योगदान बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है।
In a similar vein, Mr. President, you mentioned the more than 4 million Indian Americans who are participating in the journey of progress of America. And when I look at the importance of this decade and the role that is going to be played by this talent of the Indian Americans, I find that this people-to-people talent will play a greater role, and Indian talent will be a full partner in this relationship. And I see that your contribution is going to be very important in this.
उसी प्रकार से दुनिया में सबसे ज्यादा ड्राइविंग फोर्स बन रही है टेक्नोलॉजी। इस दशक में भारत और अमेरिका के रिश्तों में टेक्नोलॉजी, और वो भी पूरी मानवता के लिए उपयोगी हो, उस दिशा में अमेरिका ने टेक्नोलॉजी के माध्यम से बहुत बड़ी सेवा कर सकती है और एक बड़ा अवसर हमें उपलब्ध होगा।
Mr. President, in similar lines, the most important driving force in the world today would be that of technology, and the technology that is going to be for the service and for the use of humanity. And I find that opportunities for this are going to be tremendous.
उसी प्रकार से भारत और अमेरिका के बीच ट्रेड का अपना महत्व है, और इस दशक में ट्रेड के क्षेत्र में भी हम एक दूसरे को काफी पूरक हो सकते हैं। बहुत सी चीजें हैं जो अमेरिका के पास है, जो भारत को जरूरत है, बहुत सी चीजें भारत के पास है जो अमेरिका के काम आ सकती हैं। तो ट्रेड भी इस दशक का एक बहुत बड़ा क्षेत्र रहेगा।
Similarly, Mr. President, between India and the United States, trade will continue to assume importance, and we find that the trade between our two countries are actually complementary. There are things that you have and there are things that we have, and then we in fact complement each other. And I find that in the area of trade during this decade, that is also going to be tremendously important.
मिस्टर प्रेसिडेंट, आपने अभी 2 अक्टूबर महात्मा गांधी की जन्म जयंती का उल्लेख किया। महात्मा गांधी ट्रस्टीशिप की बात करते थे। ये दशक उस ट्रस्टीशिप के लिए भी बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है। महात्मा गांधी हमेशा इस बात की वकालत करते थे कि प्लेनेट के हम ट्रस्टी हैं, और हमने हमारी आने वाली पीढ़ियों को एक ट्रस्टी के रूप में ये प्लेनेट को हमने सुपुर्द करना होगा। और ये ट्रस्टीशिप की भावना भी भारत और अमेरिका के बीच के संबंधों में एक बहुत अहमियत रखेगी, और महात्मा गांधी के आदर्शों की पूर्ति के लिए ट्रस्टीशिप का सिद्धांत जो प्लेनेट के लिए हर नागरिक की जिम्मेवारी विश्व के लिए बनती जा रही है।
Mr. President, you just mentioned that on the 2nd of October we will be celebrating the birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. And Mahatma Gandhi always used to talk about the principle of trusteeship of the planet. And this decade, Mr. President, from that point of view, is also going to be important as this entire principle of trusteeship. It means that the planet that we have to bequeath it to the following generations. And this sentiment of trusteeship is going to assume more and more importance globally, but also between the relations between India and the United States. And it is these ideals that Mahatma Gandhi espoused, where he talked about trusteeship of the planet, and where the responsibility of global citizens is only going to go up.
और राष्ट्रपति जी जैसे कुछ विषयों का आपने उल्लेख किया, ये सारे विषय बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण हैं, भारत के लिए भी महत्वपूर्ण है। और आपने पदभार संभालने के बाद, चाहे कोविड हो, क्लाइमेट हो या क्वाड हो, हर एक में एक बहुत ही यूनिक इनिशिएटिव लिया है। और मैं समझता हूँ ये यूनिवर्सिटी ये जो आपका इनिशिएटिव है आने वाले दिनों में बहुत बड़ा प्रभाव पैदा करेगा और मुझे विश्वास है कि आज की हमारी बातचीत में भी इन सारे विषयों को हम विस्तार से विचार विमर्श करके हम कैसे साथ चल सकते हैं, हम एक दूसरे के लिए भी और दोनों मिलकर दुनिया के लिए भी क्या कुछ पॉजिटिव कर सकते हैं। मुझे विश्वास है कि आपके नेतृत्व में आज की चर्चा बहुत सार्थक रहेगी।
Mr. President, you mentioned very important issues, and after assuming charge as President of the United States, you have taken very unique initiatives, whether that be COVID-19, climate change, or even Quad. And in the days after that, after taking this initiative, you have made and deployed great efforts to bring them to implement your vision. And also today we have this opportunity to discuss all these issues in great detail. And after our discussions, we will look towards how we can work further together, not only for our respective countries, but for the entire world, how we can take positive action. And I am I'm absolutely convinced that under your leadership, whatever we do, it will be extremely relevant for the entire world.
राष्ट्रपति जी, मैं फिर से इस पर आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद करता हूँ इस ज्ञान में जोशी पर स्वागत के लिए।
Once again, Mr. President, let me thank you profusely for this very warm welcome.
Thank you.
Right, so we just heard the Prime Minister of India and the President of the US talking to the press after their meeting. Very interestingly, they're talking about non-violence apart from COVID-19 and climate change. What do you think is the most important issue that the US and India need to focus on at the moment?
Well, I may be biased because of my interests and focus, but I think the strategic partnership, security and defense ties, remains the bread and butter of the maturing, evolving partnership. That doesn't mean there aren't very important economic things going on. People-to-people ties are absolutely flourishing. Soft power, democratic values are all incredibly important things. But the convergence at the strategic level is reshaping the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's been one of the most consequential changes to U.S. foreign policy since the turn of the century and Indian foreign policy. And as much as we like to talk about positive aspects of the agenda, the defense and strategic relationship has to be at the core of the conversation.
So Donald Trump was a low when it comes to partnerships with America's allies, but Joe Biden has not really done very much to burnish America's image. So they dumped Afghanistan, they recently dumped France. How much should India trust Joe Biden and his administration to be a reliable partner?
Sure. In my conversations with Indian government officials, what they've talked about when they think about Washington is, and the Trump years in particular, the concern about strategic surprises. They were worried about President Trump because they perceived him as unreliable, and they didn't know what he would do next. And honestly, often he didn't know what he would do next either. In this administration, what I perceive that they are trying to do, the Biden administration is trying to do, is make a pivot away from strategic surprise. So I don't think anyone was surprised by the withdrawal from Afghanistan. What we experienced in Afghanistan was a tactical surprise, and it was one we all shared. None of us thought the Kabul government would fold like would just fold like a piece of paper, would just disappear overnight, over the course of 9 days. That lack of strategic surprise is an important reassurance towards the objective of a long-term partnership.
And these images, how do you think Beijing would be looking at these images? In China's worldview, America is the clear competitor, and India may be a challenge that they think that they will manage. But this coming together of India and the US, how do you think China sees this?
The Chinese Communist Party, in their own talk, they talk about China 2025, which was the initial high-tech agenda. They talk about China, 2049, when they believe that they can challenge the world, at least militarily to some degree. I think they would view this coming together of the United States and India as a major threat against them, because India If you think about education, emphasis on education, technological know-how, even potential diplomatic influence in the region, India is positioned to replace a lot of what the Chinese Communist Party has regionally. One of the main ways the CCP can control countries within the Asia-Pacific region, or even a bit further, is through concerns that if they cut deals with China, that they're going to, or if they offend China in any way, that they're going to get sanctioned, they're going to get hit, they're going to get threatened, and that suddenly, unless they can find another good trading partner, maybe the U.S., but maybe not because the U.S. isn't very engaged in a lot of these countries, that they're going to be essentially bankrupted or cut off. India, if they could really develop a strong export base, and especially if they could replace a lot of the industries pulling out of China right now, especially as the CCP itself is facing a lot of trouble with this, whether it's the sanctions and tariffs, whether it's, for example, what's happening with them even targeting their own businesses and trying to bring them in line. India is the prime ground for a lot of these companies to go to. For the CCP, this is like the future of their country essentially leaving if they don't play their cards right, especially with the high-tech agenda they have.
Jeff, some of us have argued that this meeting and this relationship at this point in time is more important for Joe Biden than for Prime Minister Modi. Would you agree?
I think I would leave that to the political prognosticators to ponder that question. I think it's important to both leaders, to both of their foreign policy objectives. There's very few things that the U.S. is trying to do in the Indo-Pacific that India would not be playing a critical role, and vice versa. I think the partnership with the U.S. has helped India with internal balancing, with improving its military capabilities and defense capabilities, but also improving on the world stage. I mean, the United States essentially helped rewrite the international nuclear order to make India sort of an accepted member of the club. This was back in George Bush's time and Obama's time. But I think the partnership has really served both countries' interests. Domestically, I think it's important to remember that the partnership has bipartisan support in both countries. When they're in the opposition, sometimes they play political games, but it now demonstrated over time that both main political parties in both countries are heavily invested in the relationship. Both populations are heavily invested in the relationship. India is seen very positively by the American population and vice versa. And so it's really a political win-win for both leaders.
Right, and the test of this investment will be coming in the days ahead. The S-400 shipment is due, and there's a question mark on whether America will look at CAATSA vis-a-vis India, or will they make an exception? Do you think the Biden administration is prepared to make those exceptions and invest in India as it's one of its most important allies in the region?
So this administration is pursuing a 20-year project in the Indo-Pacific. They're laying the foundation right now for forward progress in this region among a core of economic and security partners in the future. AUKUS is a 20-year project. Nuclear submarines aren't going to be in Australia for years. That's how we should think of the Quad in terms of progress. There are going to be setbacks. This is going to take one step forward, sometimes and then 5 steps back, and then it's going to launch way ahead and accelerate. This is just going to take time to do. So yes, there will be, I think, tensions over issues like where India secures its weapon shipments from. But in the long run, the commitment and the trajectory, as Jeff said a moment ago, is clear and mutual. That we both like to chart a course where India and the United States are closer economically and more closely aligned in security terms. Even if not among the core partners that is the AUKUS kind of alliance.
Traditionally, journalists focus a lot on the chemistry between two leaders. While we understand that leaders work together because it is in their national interest, and it doesn't matter who's in power eventually, you have to work with the other side. And yet, this question is always raised, how important do you think is chemistry when two countries engage with each other? And what do you make of, or how do you assess Joe Biden's equation with Narendra Modi? We saw that handshake going on forever.
I think maybe it's a little early to render judgment on their personal chemistry. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic has prevented a lot of in-person interactions, save for what's happened in the past 10 minutes on the TV screens. It is notable that they met, they spoke by phone very quickly after President Biden took office. They also spoke on the campaign trail in the lead up to the elections. By all indications, they have relatively good personal chemistry, which is something that's really been shared since, I think, President Bush and Manmohan Singh also had a very close personal relationship, and I think that has continued since then. President Biden is a very sort of folksy, backslapping, hugging type of person. Prime Minister Modi also likes to get physical and engaged. He likes to hug and he likes to backslap and smile. So I don't think there's going to be any problem there on the personal chemistry front.
Among the other things, Joshua, that they're discussing, vaccines seem to come up in every discussion, in every statement made by both sides. They're talking about making 1 billion vaccines in India and opening a supply chain. And countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, are largely reliant on Chinese vaccines. How significant do you think is this aspect of the Quad?
The vaccines are actually very significant. And I think the importance of this can't be understated. The Chinese Communist Party viewed this whole vaccine push and the control of PPE, personal protective equipment, as a diplomatic tool. They talked about vaccine, competition and so on. They were doing tests of the early Sinovac vaccine in Brazil. Brazil has actually canceled a lot of those. They found in a lot of countries that were the early testing grounds for the Chinese vaccines that they don't seem to be working, at the very least don't seem to be working. And so a lot of that is backfiring on China, as have a lot of their COVID-era policies, like wolf warrior diplomacy, where they were threatening Australia, threatening other countries. A lot of this has blown up in the face of the CCP. And so there's huge, huge potential in India pushing a functioning vaccine through the region to challenge what the CCP has done, because there's a ground for that in a lot of these areas.
Vaccines are a touchy issue in India. In the last few days, we've seen Britain come up with very arbitrary rules, and that's something that India protested. There are also travel restrictions on Indians in the US. When allies come together and make these grand announcements, do you think that these are issues that should have been resolved in the run-up to the meeting rather than wait for them to be raised?
So I certainly think on vaccines, on production, on distribution, a lot of progress has been made behind the scenes ahead of this meeting. Vaccines are a touchy subject in the United States as well. This is actually a story that I think intrinsically we understand, and that around the world we've all struggled to make our way through the pandemic. What today's meetings entail, both this bilateral and the quadrilateral later this afternoon, are really a change in the way India is positioning itself globally. They've made tremendous progress in vaccinating Indians. There's a long way to go, but the manufacturing capacity has been built up. Similarly, through the Quad, the US, Australia, and Japan have committed to purchasing huge and guaranteeing the financing for huge quantities of Indian-produced vaccines going forward. This is critical not just for our internal stability and our internal recovery both individually and as partners, but also for the rest of the world. The Global South has lagged tragically behind, as you said, in the distribution of vaccines. Ultimately, between the U.S. Now agreeing to provide about 1 billion doses of vaccine, India signing up to distribute another 1 billion over time. These are the type of large-scale solutions that it's going to take. The last thing I'd say on China is, in the early stages of this pandemic, most countries, and I think we can understand it, thought something was better than nothing. But over time, the Chinese, I think, themselves have been also accepting of alternative approaches when, again, the science plays out. It takes time. We've all been in this together. I don't necessarily view the COVID vaccine moment as an area of competition. I think that's counterproductive.
Right. Closing thoughts?
I wish some of your viewers were with me in Delhi 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I was trying to sell the idea of reconstituting the Quad, of the importance of signing Becca and Sismoa and Lamoa and strengthening defense ties and doing a 2+2. And the answer I always got was, we like you, Jeff, but these ideas go too far. India's not ready for this. We don't do alliances. The Quad fell apart in Australia. you're being too ambitious. We admire the effort, but you're being too ambitious. This is not possible. We have come so far in the past 10 or 15 years that what's happening today, even if there are not a lot of significant tangible takeaways, the symbolism of the four leaders meeting, the symbolism of the bilat is an exclamation point on the progress we've made over the past 10 years, and we have to appreciate that.
You know, I'd say the Quad is 17 years old. You talk to any 17-year-old and you say, where do you see yourself 5 years from now? They will not probably have an answer. So this is an existential teenage sort of a moment for this alliance. Maybe they need to grow up faster. But thanks very much. We're out of time. Jeff, Joshua, James, thank you very much for being here with us.